Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar hosted by Compassion in World Farming, which is part of the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate ideation series. My name is Ben Williamson. I'm the US Executive Director with Compassion in World Farming. This event is being recorded, I should just tell you. The title of this ideation is Sustainable Livestock Solutions, Building Better Systems for Animals, Nature, People, and the Planet. In a moment, I'll be introducing our guest speakers, but first I'd like to tell you a little bit about Compassion in World Farming and our role with Aim for Climate. Compassion in World Farming is an international animal welfare organization founded in 1967 in England by Peter Roberts, a British dairy farmer who became horrified by the development of intensive factory farming. And over the last 50 years or so, Compassion has been dedicated to reforming a broken food system and has tried to create a more humane, fair, and sustainable system for animals, people, and the planet. Compassion's food business team works with some of the world's biggest food companies to help establish policies that improve the lives of animals in their supply chain. And through our advocacy campaigns, Compassion works to raise awareness of the impacts of factory farming and encourage consumers to demand better. The farmed animal advocacy movement is gaining momentum, and our campaigns have reached over 100 million people and counting. If you are new to Aim for Climate, please allow me to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about it. So Aim for Climate is a joint initiative led by the United States and the United Arab Emirates. It seeks to address climate change and global hunger by uniting participants to significantly increase investment in and other support for climate smart agriculture and food systems innovation between 2021 and 2025. It launched at COP26 with a $4 billion investment in climate smart agriculture and food systems innovation, which it hopes to double to $8 billion by COP27 next year. And there are currently around 41 country government partners and about 160 non-governmental partners, which includes Compassion in World Farming. Since Aim for Climate was launched last November, Compassion has been urging the USDA to include more established regenerative solutions and protein diversification efforts into its funding priorities. And in addition to welcoming more investment in technological solutions to curb the livestock industry's contribution to the climate crisis. As we told the USDA, the IPCC has issued a code red for human-driven global heating, highlighting the need for immediate decisive action. Aim for Climate currently calls for long, multi-year research that we believe we simply don't have time for. The speakers we'll be hearing from today are leaders in solutions that are readily available now, restoring soil health, farming regeneratively, and reducing meat consumption. First up, we'll hear from Will Harris, who is a fourth-generation land steward and stockman, and he tends the same land that his great-grandfather settled in 1866. Will attended the University of Georgia School of Agriculture, but became disenchanted with the excesses of industrialized farming methods in the mid-1990s. And Will made the audacious decision to return to farming methods that his great-grandfather had used 130 years before. Will is recognized all over the world as a leader in humane animal husbandry and environmental sustainability. Chloe Waterman will be our next speaker. Chloe currently serves as the Senior Program Manager for Friends of the Earth's climate-friendly food program, where she markets campaigns to advance a healthy and climate-friendly food system. On Capitol Hill, in state houses, and across city governments, Chloe has pioneered climate-friendly food procurement policies, initiatives to expand plant-based school meal offerings, and other policies to build a just transition away from factory-farmed animal production and towards regenerative plant-based food production and a sustainable amount of higher welfare, pasture-based animal agriculture. And our final speaker will be Lasse Brun. He's the Chief Executive Officer of 50 by 40, a global multi-NGO and cross-sector movement addressing externalities of animal agriculture by catalyzing and augmenting existing and new initiatives. Lasse is an advocacy expert in climate, sustainable agriculture and food systems, and has led high-level international dialogues and campaigns in more than 20 countries, the EU Parliament, FAO, and other groups. And as I hand over to Will and stop sharing my screen and start sharing Will's, bear with me. I just want to say that you can ask a question of any of our three panelists, which we'll get to at the end of the presentations. You simply type it into the chat box on the right-hand side, and Compassion's coordinator, Ali, will moderate them, and we'll try to ask them with the time that we have left at the end. So now, Will, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate you all having me on today. I'd like to start out by, get the next slide, please. I'd like to start out by telling you a little bit about our farm. It is in Bluffton, Georgia, which is the coastal plains of Georgia in the southeastern United States. On the main farm here, which is 3,200 acres, we pasture raise 5 red meat species: cows, hogs, sheep, goats, rabbits, and we hand butcher them in a USDA inspected processing plant, slaughterhouse that I built. We pasture raise 5 poultry species: chickens, turkeys, geese, guineas, ducks, and we hand butcher them in a separate USDA inspected slaughter facility that I built. We have pastured eggs, certified organic vegetables, honey, some fruit, vegetables, nuts, and a number of other little ancillary businesses that go to feed the organism as white oak pastures. In addition, we have a store, a restaurant, we have lodging on the farm, we have a nonprofit educational entity called Center for Agricultural Resilience. Next slide, please, B. The thing that I enjoy most about the farm is how over the 150-something years, now 6 generations, the farm has come full cycle from the way that my great-grandfather, who founded the farm in 1866, and my grandfather farmed it. Theirs would have been farming methods that was really focused on the animals, the land, and the community, because that was the only wealth that they recognized during that era. Next slide, please. After my father took over in 1946, and I'll introduce you to him in a moment. But between those two watches, my grandfather and my father, is when the huge shift of American agriculture occurred. It went from the farming methods that I described previously to a very industrialized, commoditized, system. It was a very swift transition that occurred basically in 1 generation. The war effort had so much funds put into it that was repurposed for the industrialization, commoditization, centralization. The ammunition factories were found to be used for ammoniated fertilizer. The guys that had plowed mules before World War II went to the European theater and drove tanks. They came back and wanted tractors. 2,4-D herbicide came from the tear gas effort. On and on and on. You know, Europe was starving. There was a need for cheap, abundant, safe food, and the technology from the war effort made that food obscenely cheap, wastefully abundant, and safe only in the current sense of the word. Give me the next slide, please. So under my father's watch, starting in 1946, the farm became a monoculture of only cattle. It went from a polyculture of all the different species that I've said that we raise today, which is what my great-grandfather, grandfather did, to an industrialized cattle feeding operation. The operation was very dependent upon chemical fertilizers and herbicides, insecticides to grow the feed, confinement feeding of a high corn, soy diet. of all the hallmarks of a very high input technology-based farming that broke the cycles of nature. I went to the University of Georgia, came home in 1976, and ran the farm even more industrially than my father did for 20 years. Next slide, please. About in the mid-90s, we started moving away from the monoculture of cattle to the operation I described today. And just very pleased that we did. 2 of my 3 daughters came back. They're here with their families today. Next slide. The changes were focused on the animals. We made very, very intentional decisions about how we were raising our animals and how we wanted to raise our animals. As I mentioned, it was a monoculture of only cattle, a lot of hormone implants, a lot of subtherapeutic antibiotics, a lot of ionospores, total mixed ration diet, just a very, very, very industrial, uber industrial operation. And I will say that the operation was profitable. When I was farming in that way, I never lost money. I never had a year in which I didn't pay taxes. But after doing it for 20 years, I found myself enjoying it less and less and less. Next slide, please. After the change, we started making changes to animals. We recognized very quickly that the things that we were doing for the land was equally as damaging, equally as much against nature. You know, through using the technology that reductionist science had given us, we have become powerful enough to break the cycles of nature. And when you break the cycles of nature, you give up the abundance that comes when all the cycles of nature are functioning optimally. The cycles of nature are, to name a few, the carbon cycle, the mineral cycle, the water cycle, the energy cycle, the microbial cycle, on and on and on, many different cycles of nature. And the tools that nature that we've been given by reductionist science allowed us to break them. You see in the second slide there, the aerial photo, that's actually the land line of my northwestern line. The land on the left is mine, the land on the right belongs to an adjacent landowner. That happens to be where my plant, the buildings there are my processing plants that I mentioned earlier where we do our animal slaughter. But the organic model on my farm there is today a 5% organic model. Across the fence, 30 feet away, it's a 0.5% organic model. You probably know this, but 1% organic model will absorb a 1-inch rain event. If you look at the bottom right hand where the water is standing, that water on the left is coming off of my land, and it looks like weak tea. On the right is coming off that field that you can see there, and it looks like a strawberry milkshake. The top right is a shovel full of spade full of soil from my field, a dirt clod from the adjacent field. Next slide, please. So the changes that we made with regard to the land and the animals were very, very intentional. The changes that occurred in the community were very unintentional. I'm sitting now in my office in Clay County, Georgia, Bluffton, Georgia. Wikipedia tells us it was the poorest county in the United States of America, not just Georgia, the entire country in 2020, based on household income. Today, Bluffton is a thriving little community. It's gone from being literally a ghost town to being a little destination. And that occurred when we brought in, I went from 3 minimum wage employees to 190 full-time employees that make well above the county average. So when that chronic impoverishment, this just impoverished rural America all over the country, is broken when we bring in people with good jobs in regenerative agriculture. We're very proud of it. Next slide. The changes that we talked about is when we moved this farm from a very managed in a very factory-like manner to manage as a natural system. You know, this computer that I'm speaking to you from is a very complicated piece of equipment. Your body is a very complex piece of equipment. When we tried to apply the factory model for complicated to this farm, which is complex, we wound up having all sorts of unintended consequences that adversely affect the land, the animals, and the community. Next slide. And this is the result. This is 3 of my grandchildren, and 2 of my children are pregnant. So there'll be 5 total in the next 3 or 4 months. And that's the functionality of changing the way we farm. We're very proud of it. Thank you for having me. Good.
Thank you, Will. It's so great to hear from you always. You're such an expert and a leader in this area, and what you've done for Bluffton and what you've done for the community and your family is truly remarkable. We'll have a time, as I say, for questions later, because I'm sure people will have a lot of questions for you. What I'd like to do now, we practiced this earlier, is to try to make Chloe the presenter and to give Chloe the option to take us through her presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Ben. And let me know, can you see my screen, Ben?
We can indeed.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. Just to warn folks, we are going to start on a bit of a pessimistic note here, but I promise we'll end on a positive one. So this is a picture taken from space of Brazil and the fires in the Amazon in 2019. And while the news headlines about the fires has faded away, the fires have unfortunately continued to rage. And in fact, just last month had Brazil clocked the most number of fires for the month of May since the year 2005. And the primary driver of these fires is deforestation to clear land, to graze cattle for our industrial agriculture system. And so I bring this up not only to highlight the importance and urgency of addressing climate change and protecting, one of the world's most precious resources, but also to highlight that food is a major driver of climate change, even though it is often a forgotten one. So this is an image based on research, one research paper that found that food was about a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. The IPCC estimates that it's somewhere between 21 and 37% of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's mostly driven by our industrial meat and dairy production. So we see down at the bottom, the land use section, and then in the red, the livestock and fisheries, as well as this smaller section of green of crops that are grown for animal feed. The contribution of livestock to climate change is especially clear when we look at methane emissions, which of course is a greenhouse gas that is more than 80 times as potent as carbon dioxide. And this is based on US data here, finding that animal agriculture between the enteric fermentation section and manure management accounts for 36% of US methane emissions, which is more than the methane emissions from our oil and gas sector. Yet again, not a category that the media, public policymakers, and companies are focused on relative to other sectors. So you've probably seen a chart like this before, comparing the different greenhouse gas footprints of various foods. And of course, the animal-based foods tend to have a higher greenhouse gas footprint because animals are inefficient at converting energy. Chicken is perhaps the most efficient of the land animals, and it takes 9 calories of chicken feed to get 1 calorie of chicken. Beef and ruminants are in the industrial system are particular culprits because of the large amount of feed they require and the methane emissions emitted throughout the lives of those animals. So when you compare that to foods on the bottom half of this chart that are mostly plant-based foods, it becomes clear why plant-based or plant-forward diets are better from a climate perspective. We get a similar story when we look at water. The footprints of animal-based foods on our water are significantly higher for animal products compared to plant-based food products on the whole. But then, and water, of course, is an increasingly important resource as it's becoming more scarce with climate change. So at least in the US, we devote half of our cropland to growing GMO-heavy monocultures of corn and soy, primarily for animal feed, also for fuel, but not for humans to eat. And that takes massive quantities of fertilizer and pesticides that is degrading our air, water, and our soil resources, as well as endangering pollinators. And of course, these are the very resources that we need in order to continue to have a functional food system into the future, especially with increasing pressures from climate change. So in the same way that agriculture, largely driven by industrial animal agriculture, is a major driver of climate change, it can also be a major solution. So Project Drawdown is a project of Paul Hawken and a team of scientists that evaluated more than 100 climate mitigation strategies and found that reducing food waste and shifting to plant-rich diets were the third and fourth most effective strategy of those they studied. And all of the strategies highlighted in green on this slide are strategies that are related to agriculture, which I think just shows, and I know Will talked about several of these that he's implementing. And I think that this just shows how much untapped potential there is for agriculture to be a solution to climate change as well. So we had two major reports come out in 2019. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put out a land use report that warns that we need a major food system overhaul in order to have a chance of meeting the Paris Agreement targets and to avoid a catastrophic failure of our food system. At the same time, there was a report put out by the commission, the Eat Lancet Commission, that put forth a planetary health diet, proposing what is the diet that's optimal both for improving public health around the globe as well as for promoting environmental sustainability. And that was a diet that is high in fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, and seeds, and lower in industrially produced animal products. So these two reports, along with a whole body of research, I think really point to two broad solutions when it comes to mitigating the impacts of climate change, of our food system on climate change. One is shifting the types of food we produce and consume toward more plant-based foods. We talked about this a lot already in the slide deck, and this is especially important for wealthier countries, higher meat consuming countries like here in the US, where we consume 2.6 times as much meat as the global average. It's not a sustainable amount. And then we also have to shift how we produce food by employing regenerative agriculture practices like those that Will was speaking of, things like cover cropping, silvopasture, and organic agriculture. And this should apply to the animals that we continue to raise for food, as well as to plants that we are growing for people to eat. So now I'm going to go through a few solutions that are put out there that at least we at Friends of the Earth think that folks should be wary of. So one is around methane digesters, which are intended to capture the methane emitted from manure management of large industrial farms. And unfortunately, they're a cornerstone of President Biden's strategy for reducing agriculture from methane. It's a completely voluntary strategy and one that we think lacks evidence that it will actually reduce absolute methane emissions, because even while it reduces emissions from manure management, if emissions from enteric fermentation from growing herd sizes increase, then that can very easily offset the methane reductions from the manure management. And if producers have another source of income from animal waste, then they may be incentivized, and in many cases have been incentivized, to increase their herd sizes. Methane digesters also fail to address the fundamental flaws of our factory farming system, including the co-pollutants, things like nitrous oxide and ammonia, other co-pollutants that come as a result of concentrating massive quantities of waste in communities, which are largely communities of color and low wealth communities. And then feed additives similarly is another solution that we are wary of. You've probably seen some headlines about feeding red algae to cows, things like that. And I think that it's fine to continue this research, but there isn't much evidence so far that this strategy would at all be scalable, that we could farm enough red algae in the ocean and not have the adverse impacts on ocean and marine health to be able to sustain this. And then, of course, again, it doesn't address the other problems associated with our concentrated agriculture system, which Will spoke a little bit about, but again, harms to communities, harms to water, to soil health, harms to animals, the prevalence of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, the potential for growing hotbeds for the next pandemic. None of these are going to be addressed by these sorts of false solutions. Likewise, we think that folks should be wary of carbon markets or carbon pricing in agriculture, which has not proven to be effective at reducing emissions and can exacerbate environmental justice concerns by concentrating more pollution in already overburdened low wealth and communities of color. And then similarly, net zero claims have kind of taken the rage. I imagine there are probably some attendees of this webinar from companies or governments that have made net zero claims. We are really concerned about these, see them as greenwashing. We want to see absolute claims, absolute reduction targets and tracking toward those goals. Net zero claims by relying on carbon offsets and sometimes non-existent or yet to be proven technologies like carbon capture and storage and geoengineering are claims that are not tied to the real reductions that we need to see now. They follow a burn now, pay later model. Exxon, JBS, a lot of companies have these claims, and I think it's good to be wary of them and really prioritize claims for targets for absolute emission reductions. And then the third so-called solution to be wary of, I think, is genetically engineering animals to better fit them into factory farms. So if this muscly cow isn't reason enough for you to be wary of this claim, there are also grave public health dangers as well as food safety and animal welfare concerns associated with this. And again, why genetically engineer animals to better fit into a system that is at its core extractive and exploitative when we have real solutions around shifting the types of food that we're producing, as well as shifting the ways we're producing those foods. So I wanted to end with some ideas around actual projects, some concrete projects using the innovation sprint model that was put forth by the Aim for Climate initiative that use the real solutions that I was speaking about. So one is around climate-friendly food procurement and food service. So if you are a company or a government that procures or serves a significant amount of food, track the emissions associated with that food, set targets for reducing those emissions. You should also set targets for how much of the meat do you want to purchase that comes from higher welfare pasture-based sources like white oak pastures. So set goals and meet them. One example of this is the Cool Food Pledge, which uses a peer-reviewed open source methodology to track emissions with the goal of reducing them by 25% by 2030. A whole bunch of companies and governments have signed up for this program and to reduce emissions by 25% by 2030. There's also a lot that we can do to leverage research in behavioral economics and behavioral psychology to shift consumer attitudes and consumer behavior when it comes to consuming more climate-friendly diets and shifting away from industrial meat production. So leveraging some of those particularly if you have a food service operation or marketing strategies meant to influence your customers. And then last, I think there's a lot of potential for research, technical assistance, and investment in capital costs that would support farmer transitions away from the industrial model of animal production or to regenerative agriculture practices. And if you're a government, I would add to this list a shifting of subsidies. As Will mentioned, the price of meat has been made artificially cheap through a lack of regulation and government subsidies that don't allow it to reflect its true cost. So let's help farmers transition to producing animal products and plant-based foods that are better for the climate, but also might provide a better economic outlook for them. There are a lot of producers, think about, dairy producers and how much dairy producers are struggling right now in a hyper-concentrated economy. Let's employ the model that we did with tobacco, where we recognize the level of tobacco production that we had was a grave public health concern, and we need to shift to different types of agriculture, but also support the people. We do have to support the people whose livelihoods depend on these industries, and there's a lot of potential for governments and companies as well to support producers in your supply chain to shift to what will ultimately be more environmentally and financially sustainable types of agriculture. I'm going to end with two concrete examples that I think demonstrate how some of these strategies could be employed to really transform our food system if employed at scale. So this is a case study from Oakland Unified School District in California, which reduced the meat and dairy products on their menus and were able to save 42 million gallons of water, achieve a 14% reduction in their carbon footprint. And if they had tried to achieve that same reduction in their carbon footprint by installing solar panels, they would have had to install 87 solar panels at a cost of over $3 million. But instead, they were actually able to save money. And I love this story because they devoted some of the cost savings that they had into purchasing local meat, into purchasing better quality fresh fruits and vegetables. And even on top of that, they were able to save $42,000. So we love this example of kind of showing the triple benefit of healthy and climate-friendly food and this kind of less and better purchasing strategy. If we purchase less of the expensive industrial produced meat, we can afford to buy better meat. And then last, this is a picture of Mike Weaver, who is the president of the Virginia's Contract Poultry Growers Association, and Leah Garces from Mercy for Animals. And Mike here transitioned his poultry houses into a hemp farm and indoor hemp farm and processing facility, and had both a better financial outlook with his new operation, as well as feeling like he can better contribute to the kind of environmentally sustainable climate that we want to have in the future. So if we can replicate this story through significant investments coming from governments and companies within their supply chains, I think we have a lot of potential to really transform our food system. So with that, I will close. I have my email up here if anyone wants to reach out for specific questions, and I will transfer us back over to Lassa. Let's see if I can do this successfully.
Great, looks up. Thank you very much.
You can see my screen?
You can, thanks, Lassa.
Right, all right. Thanks a lot to both, oops, just getting into the right screen here. Thanks a lot to both Will and Chloe for their presentations, and it's always great to be on a panel with people who have different perspectives, but essentially want the same thing as I see it. And also, huge kudos to you, Will, for doing the transition you talked about in your presentation. It must have been quite the change, both from a family perspective, from a financial perspective, as we saw, but also an emotional perspective, and must have taken a lot of bravery. And also, I believe I heard you said you had 3,300 acres, which is quite a lot. I am actually myself a part-time farmer, very small scale. I have 7 acres, and I think that is a lot to do. Most of it is by hand. It's also organic, but 3,300 acres, I can hardly imagine how much that is. So kudos for that. So in my presentation here, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the organization I represent and why we came together, and talking about some of the aspects I think is preventing us from progressing to a more sustainable and equitable food system. And also just a little caveat to make, that I work predominantly internationally, so I'm looking at this from an international lens and towards some of the work we do in multilateral spaces, such as the UNFCCC, for instance. So just to reemphasize what has already been pointed out also by Chloe, and that's like you, Chloe, I'm also starting a little bit of a bummer, that you know, the basis of 50 by 40 and the work we do in the movement as such is that we have a broken and fragile food system. I think we can all agree on that. And also, to build the resilience, we need to have a fair, healthy, and compassionate food system. And you can see there's a picture of Ukraine here, because the situation in Ukraine with the war has made it clear just how fragile the food system is and how important it is we build resilience moving forward. The failed harvest in Ukraine, the sanctions against Russia, and so forth, is going to have strong implications for the rest of the world, particularly in the MENA region, where the COP is going to be held, the UNFCCC COP is going to be held at the end of the year. Another thing is that just transition, there's no global approach to addressing just transition within global food systems. You're seeing it starting to emerge now, and in 50 by 40, we've been working on it for many years, but there has so far not been a joint approach, and there's been very strong differences between those who focus a lot on the market balance, and also those who focus on the more social justice balance exclusively. And that leads to the next point about theory of change. There hasn't been a really good common theory of change. Some groups are focusing a lot on the decentralization. So, like I would say, for instance, Chloe and Friends of the Earth, food sovereignty, equitable distribution of funds, and using that lens to empower people to grow their own food within their own spaces they live in, within their own terms. Whereas some groups are focusing a lot on using the market economy to really push through quick transitions with the big corporations, without necessarily addressing so much the need for the ownership of food production to change. Also, there's been like different approaches to who the gatekeepers are. Like, are we predominantly engaging with corporations? Are we predominantly engaging in the policy space with consumers, behavioral change, and so forth? And the funding side, which I'm going to come back to later on in my presentation, is, well, from the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, and also public funds more generally, there's been very little focus on how to transition the food system. A lot of the funding goes into models that were the ones that Will was warning us against, as opposed to those that we want to see, such as those production. And also, there's no common narrative. The way we talk about food, the way we engage in food, the way it is presented by stakeholders, whether it's farmers, consumers, NGOs, policymakers, and so forth, it's all over the place. And it must be really hard for top-level decision makers and also consumers to make the right choices based on that. So 50 by 40, just to do a quick plug here, we are 70+ organizations from around the world working on many different things like social justice, human rights, animal welfare, research, climate change, faith, what have you, and I'm using many different approaches like litigation, advocacy, political campaigning, and also having very different theories of change, but we all have a common goal of 50 by 40. We use collective impact, and I'm going to just mention this briefly here because I believe this is one of the best ways to do long-term, to create long-term change. A lot of the things we're seeing within the movement and then within many sectors, indeed, is the focus on a more linear approach or having more incremental changes. But when we're addressing systemic change, you cannot have systemic change unless you have a collaborative approach. And that's the essence of 50 by 40, and I will hope over the time for the whole movement is that we move towards collective impact. So we are working closely together and sharing goals and having many different theories of change, many different voices, but all kind of working towards the same goal. So I want to start a little bit with talking about some of the biggest problems, I think, from a financial perspective, and I touched on that in one of my previous slides. So average, and these figures are 2017 figures. There are newer ones, but I want to stick to those who are certain here. So this is at the very least, probably much, much more, $436 trillion worldwide each year is used for climate change mitigation work. And out of that, less than 1% is spent on livestock production. And as was presented by Chloe, livestock production accounts for at least 14.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see there's a huge disproportional distribution of funding for some of the areas where the biggest changes can be made. So that's a huge problem that we in the movement and 50 by 40 are working to address. A little bit on the science. I'm not going to go too much into that because Chloe covered that really, really well. But I just want to say one thing I really took notice of in the new IPCC report that came out early this year is this quote you see here. In a nutshell, it is saying, in order for us to break that barrier of overconsumption in the global north and nutrition deficiency and food insecurity in the global south, there needs to be a global change. That means that there's a direct link between the overconsumption in the north and the hunger in the south because of the way land is used, because of the way feed is used, and so forth. And this is the first time I've seen it so directly written in an IPCC report, and it really, really pleased me when I saw this, because I think this is a first step towards having these serious conversations about equitable food distribution, which accounts for such a huge problem, but also could be a really big solution if tackled in the right way. So just livestock transition. Well, just livestock transition is a term we use in 50 by 40, and it was coined some years ago, looking at the power of a just transition. I used to work on energy systems as well, and I had seen how the power of being able to talk about job creation, talk about increased GDP, talk about ways of increasing the value of food and the way food is produced energy, the way energy is produced. So have seen a shift, for instance, from energy based on fossil fuels to renewable energy setup, demonstrated huge changes. For instance, it used to be that you could talk about if you invest $1 million in fossil fuels, you create 7 jobs. You invest $1 million in renewable energy, you create 14 jobs, twice as many jobs. They're better paid, they're more equitable, and there's a better bottom line for the countries that make those investments. So the GDP will be used. So we took this kind of lens and tried to apply it to the agriculture and the food systems, particularly on livestock, because we think that is the most important place to interact. So with that, we chose to focus on certain things. One is that the Sustainable Development Goals. Another thing is the Paris Agreement. And it is clear that unless we change the trajectory on now, we will not be able to meet the SDGs by 2030, and the Paris Agreement will not be achieved as well. And the same goes with the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have a huge problem. There's a huge link between the aspect of factory farming and the biodiversity loss. So one of the things we are now going one layer down, really focusing on is of course, the climate change mitigation aspects of shifting to less and better, the sustainable livelihoods, which I'll talk more about in a second, the food sovereignty aspects, like shifting away from K-foods to smallholder farmers, applies the food sovereignty lens and enables people to produce food on their terms and take away some of the conglomerate ownership. And of course, with us eating less animal protein, you have better health, so we improve the public health, and it also applies to the equitable distribution in the global south and north I mentioned before. And it overall strengthens the food system, so that takes us back to the resilience part. I want to talk a little bit now about the aspect of the job creation aspect. In 2020, there was a new study that came out by the Inter-American Development Bank and the International Labor Organization, the ILO, that stated that if Latin America and the Caribbean were to shift to a much more plant-based diet by 2030, it would create 15 million jobs. And they didn't get that much attention, I have to say, but in 50 by 40, many of our partners really dug into it and saw the potential for change from a financial lens. And since then, we've been working strongly to try to apply that lens. So, you know, it used to be like this: you go to a multilateral forum like the UNFCCC, like the COP, or the intersessionals that are taking place in Bonn right now. You could talk to the Minister of Climate and say, well, you want to cut down on animal protein consumption. Say, yeah, that makes sense. You could say the same to the Minister of Health. That would make sense. You could say the same to the Minister of Environment. That would make sense. But then when you reach the Minister of Finance and say, sorry, folks, we need to focus on growth. We need to make sure that our GDP increases. We need to have consistent growth trajectory for our country. And now here's the good news. All initial studies demonstrate that we can actually address that aspect as well. So not only will the shift we're advocating be good for the planet, for the animals, for public health, it will also be good for the bottom line, for the GDP of the country. And right now, the ILO is looking into doing a global study that we foresee will have the same conclusion. Just a few things on that. When you talk about the changes we need to make, I normally say this: the 2020s is the decade of irreversible legacies. These are the last years we can safeguard the future for all. And I say that because, as you're seeing with species extinction, with the growing warming, with the health epidemic we're having, either nutrition inefficiency or obesity, we are not in a good place, and some of the choices we're making now cannot be reversed, not for many, many, many years. So we have to make quick changes. So that brings me to the part of where does the changes need to start first? Well, you know, I like to talk about the common but differentiated responsibility principle. Everybody carries the responsibility, but those who created the problems in the first place, the onus of the responsibility lies with them. And as you can see here, that is particularly the G20 countries, more specifically the G7 countries. They have to be the ones that are shifting their food production and cutting down on the overconsumption, allowing for an equitable food distribution. And you just put it in 2025 there as well, because we've now moved from crisis to emergency. In just a few years, in 3 years' time, we'll be 2025, 5 years away from the SDGs, and 10 years after the Paris Agreement was put in paper. And we are really, really far from achieving any of those goals. So what do we do? And this is my last slide here. Well, collaboration is key, coming back to what I started about the collective impact. There's no silver bullet. We need to involve and talk to policymakers, funders, farmers, and the consumers. We also need to have a really serious reality check. First of all, business as usual is not an option, to the point that Chloe was making with biofeed, with feed additives and so forth. We cannot have any technical solutions to address something so big and systemic. We also need to build a respect for production and the producers. I think it's so important that we have a dialogue here where Will is with us, because, Will, you're producing the food people are eating, and we need to stop this animosity, this vilification of farmers, and actually show everybody wants to achieve the same thing, at least the smallholders or the more sustainable producers as you. We also need to move beyond the paradigm of the last century and work with nature. There's been this ongoing fight from René Descartes that we have to work against nature, we have to work with nature, and as well as been preaching shifting to agroecology and regenerative farming. So in conclusion, we need to have like much fewer animals produced that are treated much, much better. And also we need to talk about the true value of food. I totally agree with what was put forward by Chloe, that food is often too cheap. And I have to say, this is from a global north perspective. Let's also be clear on availability and affordability. But many people take for granted that a steak or a kilo of potatoes or whatever it might be is very, very, very cheap. And that is because it's artificially subsidized to be incredibly cheap. So there needs to be a mindset change as well. Like my grandparents would have a massive proportion of their budget go to food, whereas subsequent generations are using very little. And today in some countries, in the UK, about 10% of the household income goes to food, which is ridiculous, while people focus on buying all kinds of things they might not need. So we need to move towards less and much, much better. The final thing I want to say here is we have to have some concrete ways of framing this and taking this forward. And 50 by 40 is now working with different stakeholders on producing specific roadmaps that takes the following thesis. We are now in 2022. By 2030, we need to try to meet the SDGs and have dramatically advanced on the climate change of the Paris Agreement and shifting to a sustainable food system. And in order to do that, there's a trajectory. Nobody has a clear overview of what that trajectory is, but we're going to work with countries and a multi-stakeholder group that is engaging in political, financial, environmental aspects to come up with those roadmaps that demonstrates what steps need to be taken incrementally to create the systemic change. And as always, we need to look at the big next events where we can put this forward. COP27 is a big next moment that everybody's looking at to talk about the food and climate change nexus. But COP28, I think, is going to be even more important because that is where we have to make those irreversible legacy decisions. Otherwise, we won't get there. And I'll leave you with this little picture of where I normally farm. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lasse. That's your 7 acres, is it?
It is indeed. A snapshot of it, of course.
Wonderful.
How I pass this on to you.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for that wonderful presentation, and Chloe, thank you for yours. We have had some questions from the audience, which is fantastic. And Will, if I can come to you first, please, and I'll just stick this up here. So, Will, the question that we had from the audience was from Mina. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Annika. They both asked, what do you think about the relationship between high animal welfare and the environmental impact of livestock agriculture, particularly, and this is the loaded part of the question, particularly around how higher welfare equals less efficiency? And after Will's done, if anybody else wants to jump in from the panel, you're welcome to do so.
It's a good question. So first of all, the way that we farm, not white oak pasture, the way that food is grown primarily is done in a very industrial manner, a highly scalable manner for efficiency. That's been, smart people have been working on that for 80 years. It's gone a long way towards perfecting it. What we do at white oak pastures is not highly scalable. It's highly replicatable. It's not highly efficient. It's highly resilient. I think the resilience and efficiency often are the scalability are the antithesis of each other. You know, I guess I'm the only one on this call that doesn't know how many pounds or grams of meat a person should eat per year. I don't know that. But here's what I do know. This farm right here has 100,000 tons of carbon in the soil that wasn't there 25 years ago. And I have added 0 carbon to the soil. So where did all that carbon come from? Every ounce of it used to be greenhouse gas that through photosynthesis was turned into solid carbon, and then ultimately that percentage of it was sequestered in the soil. There's so many things I don't know, but there's one area that I think I'm an expert in, and that is taking dead land. Dead land, my definition is land that has had the cycles of nature broken by industrial farming. It doesn't have life in it anymore. I don't believe there is any cost-effective way of taking dead land and regenerating it without animal impact. You know, the cycles of nature, the evolutionary way that that we have, the ecosystems that we have, all involve animal impact. And if you believe that you can bring life back to soil and take a major component out, like animal impact, it's like saying you're going to take your grandmother's recipe for chocolate cake and replicate it, but not put the sugar in it. It's an essential part of that evolution. So you know, I was involved in industrial confinement animal feeding for 20 years. So actually all my life until 20 years ago. I did it professionally, successfully for 20 years. And I do know that that technology using all that tillage and chemical fertilizer and pesticides and confinement feeding animals with an unnatural diet and ionophores and subtherapeutic antibiotics, it does break the cycles of nature. But the only way to restart the cycles of nature is through biomimicry, and that is emulating nature. And animal impact is an essential part of it. Thank you.
Chloe, I don't know if you wanted to come in.
Sure. I mean, I agree with Will. I don't think that we have to accept one or the other, efficiency or animal welfare. I think the less and better strategy, we need to, you know, produce and consume fewer animals, but we need to treat them better is the solution to that. And, you know, yes, a chicken that's been genetically modified over years to be so big that it can't stand up. Yeah, maybe we get more pounds of chicken, more calories for each pound of carbon dioxide equivalent emitted into the atmosphere, but at what cost? At the cost of the chicken being able to stand up. And so that's not an acceptable cost. And we have to look at these issues holistically. If you look at just the environmental component, if you look at just the economic component, just the animal welfare component, you're always going to be missing the picture. So I think that we have to look at these issues holistically.
Thanks. We had another question about, obviously, and Chloe, you put up the example of Oakland and how they've managed to measure their reductions. How can we predict or measure the GHG emission reductions from the solutions that have been proposed today? What's the way of doing it for companies that are looking to do more of this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that the CDP and going through the process of establishing a science-based target for Scope 3 emissions, there's a lot of guidance that they've put forward around measurement. I also mentioned the World Resources Institute has like a plug-and-play calculator that you can use. That's probably best suited for institutions like universities or cities to be able to use. But for companies, you know, leaning on the CDP and going through that process of establishing a science-based target for absolute reductions, again, not an emissions intensity target or a net zero target, but look to get those absolute reductions. And I know Will has gone to the extra step of doing a life cycle analysis specific to his farm too. So if you're, that's how you get to understand the really specific benefits of case-specific strategies that you can employ. You want to say something about that, Will?
We did have a life cycle assessment done on this farm, and the numbers have been bickered about endlessly, and I don't know what the right numbers are. You know, the LCA showed 3.5 pounds of carbon sequestered per pound of grass-fed beef we produce. And academics did that. I didn't do it. You know, I showed them where the pasture was. Other academics were incensed and said, no, it's not that much. And you know, I really wish we had a good hard number, but the methodology of measuring it is not worked out. It's not perfected. And I wish it was, but you know, I can take a spade in the back of my Jeep and turn over a shovel full of my land and it's black, and turn over a shovel full of my nature's land right over the fence and it's red. And the pigmentation came from carbon. There's nothing else in there. I didn't put anything black on that land. So you know, we do need good methodology, but I sense that there's so much pride of ownership of technique among so many of these researchers and academics that we're arguing over how to measure it and not arguing over the best way to accomplish the goal.
Thank you, everybody. And maybe the final question to Lasse, because we're out of time. Nicholas asked, I noted that Lasse indicated that food should be more expensive. This seems to be inconsistent with the Sustainable Development Goals of number 1, no poverty, and number 2, zero hunger, and potentially others. Maybe Lasse, you can provide more details on how to achieve laudable goals of reducing environmental impact of food production in a manner that addresses the reality of growing populations. Yeah, thank you. If you have time.
Yeah, I can just do brief, and it's a really good observation, but I wanted to come back to the thing I said that about the onus of the responsibility lies with the high income countries. And I know even within a country like the US, there's a huge discrepancy in terms of affordability and availability. But for those who have enough, the food should be adjusted. And it's a general mindset. I'm not talking about those who live in semi or real poverty, but definitely not in those living in countries that are suffering from hunger or food insecurity and nutrition deficiency. We're talking about people like myself. Like, should I buy the new iPhone, or should I spend a bit more of my budget on food instead of buying the really cheap food that actually doesn't really represent the LCA, so the life cycle analysis costs of producing that food? So there needs to be a balance there that is really important. I also just wanted to say one more thing, and I think it is really crucial in terms of collaboration. I'm so glad we're here together with Will as well, and I know, Will, you're engaging a lot with the movement as such, because I often feel there is some animosity between some farmers who want to get away from the producing less, or like that we need to eat less, and also preaching that we should eat less. I think we want the same thing. We generally across the globe, particularly in the global north, need to eat much less meat. But the meat that is there will have to be produced in the way that Will does it. And if that is done in the right way, then the market share of Will and other producers like that will dramatically increase. But then we just need to close down the CAFOs.
Will, please.
So I agree with Lasse, but I think that food today is incredibly expensive, but the expense has been offset to other places than where it's paid for at the pump. Externalized, the costs are externalized. You know, how much is it going to cost us, some of us, to clean up the dead area in the Gulf of Mexico where all this pesticide and chemical have gone? You know, we're eating cheap at a great long-term expense. So, you know, and when we start talking about the price of food, we got to be very careful, because there are at least two great ills. One is the broken food production system that's poisoning the earth, and the other one is income disparity. And it's two very, you know, we have people who are so poor they can't afford good food, and it shouldn't be that way. So please don't make the problem worse by trying to put economic disparity and the broken food system together and fix it with one pill. It's two very separate items. There's the broken food system that's not producing cheap food. It's externalizing the cost of food production. And then there's economic disparity, which also needs to be fixed. That's a different set of people. I can fix the food system. I can't fix economic disparity.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. We could talk about this for hours, but Aim for Climate only gave us an hour. So thank you so much for all of the contributions. Will, Chloe, Lasse, appreciate your time. Thanks to everybody who stayed on the call. I'm sorry we're a little over time. And just if you want any more information on the innovation sprints that Chloe mentioned, you can go to aimforclimate.org and click on the innovation sprints link. And please do, if you need to get in touch with anybody, you can contact Compassionate World Farming, and we'll pass your message on to the panelists. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and I hope you have a pleasant day or evening wherever you are.
Thanks so much.